Welcome back everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the 7th round of the Global Chess League, which is being held here in London. Now today's matchup is a big one. I'm playing with the black piece against Alireza Firouzja, originally from Iran, now representing France, and he is on an absolute tear. He has won 5 games in a row. He beat Magnus, he beat me, he beat Vachier, he beat Maxime twice. So 5.5 points out of 6, hottest player in the field, and today I'm playing against him with the black pieces, and I want to try to slow down his progress. All right. Game starts out with the move c4. Here I play the move e6. Now, obviously, Alireza, we are here in England, so he decides to play the English opening. We get g3, d5, bishop g2, knight f6, knight f3, bishop e7, castles, castles, and now Alireza plays this move d3. Now, the normal move that white will play here is the move d4, going to the classic Catalan system versus the Queen's Gambit decline, but Alireza is taking some inspiration here from the famous 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen when he plays move d3. Now, this move was actually played in the famous match in the SEC between Magnus and the future first American world champion Hans Niemann. So we get this position after d3 here, and now I play the move b6. Now when I play b6, I want to fianchetto my bishop to b7 here to counteract this bishop on g2. Alireza takes, I take back with the horse. Now I could have taken with the pawn here, but after knight c3, bishop b7, and bishop to f4 here, white has ideas like d4, knight e5, rook c1, and just in general, white has a small advantage, and frankly, I don't want this pawn structure. So I decide to take with the knight on d5. Alireza goes d4, bishop b7, and now he plays the move e4, building the classic big white center. However, one of the great things about this opening for me is that my moves here are reactionary. So every move that I played over the past 2 to 3, 4 moves down the road are going to be moves that I play like this, as if it's like my fingers are snapping. Now, what that means is that I can build up a bit of a time advantage, so I'll have some time later on to use at a critical moment. So I go knight f6, Alireza plays the move e5 here, and now I go knight back to d5, and in this position, Alireza plays the move h4. Now this is a move that I actually like quite a bit here with h4, because Alireza creates some space on the king side, knight g5, hooking and hitting the pawn on h7, and just in general, it takes some space in this position. So I go over the move knight to d7 here, and now Alireza plays knight c3. I trade the horses and I go c5. Now, thus far, all my moves have been pretty straightforward here. I've developed my b's. I've got the bishop on b7, bishop on e7, and now it becomes a game of whether white's center is a little bit weak here, or can white try to attack on the king side very, very quickly. So Alireza plays move knight to g5 here. I trade the b's, and now I play the move pawn takes pawn. Now, one thing that I told myself in this position during the game is that I'm gonna move quickly. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not gonna spend a lot of time trying to find some creative way to play the position. I want to play simple, fundamentally sound chess. So because of that, I play this move pawn takes pawn rather than playing something like queen c7. And after queen to f3, let's just say I take, for example, this position starts to get very sharp with ideas like rook h1 and queen h5. I'm probably okay, but it's going to be a bit of a fight. So I decide to trade on d4, and now I go knight to b8. You will notice here that my knight is a little bit misplaced. I can't go to f6, I can't go to c5 or b6. The pawns in the center of the board simply restrict the horse on d7. So knight b8 is a logical move here because now I want to redevelop the knight to c6 and put pressure on the pawns on d4 and e5. Now, I could have played the move bishop takes g5 here, and after bishop takes g5, f6 here, probably equalize after takes, but I wanted to play a little bit more concretely. So we get takes, I go knight b8 here. Now you'll notice I'm playing these moves pretty quickly. My ideas are pretty free-flowing, and I should not be in much danger. So Alireza goes queen to f3 here, and this is actually a very important move here because if white were to play something like, I don't know, let's say bishop e3, after knight to c6, now there's pressure on these central pawns here. Let's just say white goes queen d2. If I can take and then play something like queen to d5 check, f3, and rook f d8, let's just say rook d1 and rook c8 here. Black is doing very well. A lot of pressure in the middle of the board here. King is a little bit weak here. There's some ideas to infiltrate on the c file, and if anybody is better, it is black. So queen to f3 is a very good move from Alireza here because what he's doing is he's pressuring the rook here, and I can't put the knight on c6. If I play knight c6, I lose the horsey, and I resign the game on the spot. So I go over this move queen to d5, and this is a move that I played very, very quickly once again. I simply wanted to not use a lot of time and play natural moves. Now, when I go queen d5, Alireza trades the queens, and now he plays move knight h3. What Alireza is trying to argue here is that with his knight coming to f4 and these central pawns, which can easily be protected, white should be better. Now, surprisingly, the engine is giving white a big advantage here. I thought I was marginally worse, but I felt that because of the time advantage and the easy play that I'm going to show in the next couple of moves, I wouldn't be in too much danger. So I go for the move knight to c6 here, and now Alireza plays bishop to e3, guarding the pawn on d4, and here I play the move f6, trying to chip away at the white center. Now, the computer here, I think, wants bishop b2, which is kind of interesting to me that this is the best move, because when you put the bishop on b2, it looks a little bit less active, but it actually makes a lot of sense on the other hand, because if you put the bishop on e3 here, even if you get the knight to f4, for example, where is this bishop going? The diagonal is simply hemmed in here by the pawn, so bishop has no scope whatsoever. So bishop b2 apparently better, but we get bishop e3, and now I play the move f6, trying to chip away at the white center. After f6, we get rook c1, I play rook c8, and now Alireza goes for this move knight to f4. Now, thus far, I've managed my time superbly. I'm up 2.5 minutes on the clock here. It's a simplified endgame, and it doesn't feel all that dangerous. Now, Alireza could have played a move like e6 here, but it starts to get very double-edged, because after bishop d6, let's say rook c2, and knight to e7, rook c1, for example, I can trade and go rook c8, and all of a sudden this pawn on e6 is becoming a serious weakness. If he trades, let's say king f3 and king f8, suddenly I'm going after the juicer on e6, and I might even win the game. So Alireza goes knight to f4, temporarily hanging the pawn on e5, but in return he will win the pawn on d5. So I take, he takes, and now I go for a very important move, bishop a3, attacking the rook on c1. If I were to play the move pawn takes pawn, which might look quite natural, I actually lose the game on the spot, because here white can sack the rook with rook takes knight, and if I take the rook, there's knight takes bishop, forking my king and my rook. I move the king, he takes, I take, but now I'm simply down a horse on c6, and I will resign the game very soon. So I go bishop a3 here, removing the bishop from being under attack. Meanwhile, I hit the rook on c1. Alireza goes rook c3, I take the juicer on d4, he takes, and now I play the move knight takes bishop. Now, I spent quite a bit of time here. Initially, I did not want to play knight takes bishop, but at the end of the day, I couldn't find a better move. One of the moves that I considered playing, and I almost actually reached for it, was the move rook d8. But if I play rook d8, white has the very nasty counter sack. Knight takes pawn on b6 here. Now the rook and the b are under attack. If I take the knight, after bishop takes pawn, suddenly the rook and the b are under attack again. And if I play a move like bishop b4, white can sack the rook with rook takes knight, and after takes, bishop takes d8. Maybe I can still draw with rook c2, but at any rate, I'm simply down 2 pawns. So after bishop takes d4, I decide to take the bishop, he takes my bishop, and now I go rook f7, stopping the fork with knight e7 here, but also guarding the rook on a7, or also guarding the pawn on a7 from being captured. Now at this point, material is even, but because I've spent a bit of time, I'm down a minute on the clock here. Now that being said, it is a relatively simplified endgame, so I should be in no danger. Alireza goes rook d1, I go knight f5, and now he plays move h5. Here I play the move g6. Worth pointing out that knight d6 would actually be okay here. I did briefly consider this move, but I thought after knight b6, rook c2, there might be some tactic here. I didn't want to allow it, and I also did not want to burn 3 or 4 minutes and get into a situation where the clock might come into play. So I go g6 here. Alireza trades, and now he plays move g4, kicking my knight away from the f5 square. Now, after this move, I have a tough decision here. Time is about even, but I have to figure out, do I play knight h4, knight h6, or knight e7? Now, I spent a bit of time here before making my decision. Initially, I wanted to play this move knight to h6 here, but after g5, knight f5, and knight f6, the knight is hooked here. We have a bastion, and after king f8, rook to h3, suddenly it's getting very, very dangerous for me to play. Additionally, I considered playing knight g7 here as well, but after king g3 followed by f4 or g5, again, this knight on d5 is very, very well placed, and it feels like I'm struggling. So ultimately, I make what I think is a very good decision. I play the move knight to e7. Now, I'm sacking a pawn on a7, but this leads to a forced endgame with only rooks and pawns. Now, the old adage or saying goes that all rook and pawn endgames are drawn. So even though I'm down a juicer here after this trade, because it's 3 versus 2 and it's A versus B, if I can trade off these 2 pawns on the queen side, I will reach a theoretically drawn endgame. And even better, I have 7 minutes and 40 seconds on the clock, so time pressure should not play a role. So I go rook c2, we get rook d7. Alireza could have played rook b5, but as I mentioned earlier, this endgame should be a draw. He goes rook d7, I go here, and now he goes rook to a7, trying to keep the a pawn on the board. Here I play the move rook b2, we get king g3, and now I play the move g5, stopping white from going to f4 with the pawn. Now white can always play f4, but after takes rook b4, king g3, and king g6, this will also be a forced draw. So he goes king f3, I go b5 here. Now what I'm trying to do is very simple. If I were a little bit careless here, say I go rook b5, and white is somehow able to get an endgame like this, for example, just to set it up, white might actually be a little bit better in this resulting endgame here if he can get these pawns on f3 and g4 and try to wind the king all the way around to the queen side. Now, it's still a draw with perfect play, but there are real chances for white to win. So what I want to do is I want to avoid this endgame completely, which is why I go b5, trying to play b4, b3, and trade off these two pawns. Alireza goes check, I go back, he goes here, I go back to g6, we get here, and now I play the move b4. Alireza checks, I go here, and now he plays the move rook b6, trading the a2 and b4 pawns. Now, one line that I was thinking about while Alireza was thinking was maybe he could try f3 here, because after b3, white can maybe go for this tricky move a3, and after rook b1, there might be a king d2 move, but I have rook f1 here, and now I'm threatening to go b2 and b1 to win the game, and if white goes king c3, takes, king b2, I go rook f4, and this endgame with one pawn each, the a versus the g pawn, will also be a draw. So Alireza goes rook b6, now we trade the pawns, and we've reached an endgame, which should be a theoretical draw. White does have one extra pawn on f2, but with a 2v1, it's hard to make any progress. So we get check, I go here, check back, we get this here, and now we play a bunch of waiting moves. The reason I put the rook on a6, by the way, I want to stop white from playing rook d6. Now I start checking, he goes back. If Alireza were to play king c5, rook to f4 is a forced draw, because after rook d3, I simply can wait forever with my king, even if he gets the king up here. At some point, there's no way for white to do anything, because I have a bastion, the pawn guards the rook, and both these pawns are under attack permanently, and more importantly, the king can't get back. You can't go to the 4th rank, so the rook is stuck guarding the pawn for the rest of the game. So Alireza goes here, I go back, goes here, we play a bunch of waiting moves. Eventually, he starts checking, and now he tries to play rook d3 and bring his king forward. I go rook a5, we get king to e3, and now I play the move king e6. Alireza goes rook b3, I go rook a4, he checks, I go back, and now he plays rook d6. Here I go rook b4, he goes rook d4, and of course I move the rook away. I do not want to trade the rooks, as I will lose the king and pawn endgame. So I go rook b6, he goes king to e4, and now I play king f6, rook c4, and I go rook a6, simply waiting, asking him what he's going to do. Alireza now goes king d5, I play rook to a5, and here we get a horrible mistake from Alireza in this position. Now, I suspect that Alireza thought the game is a draw, nothing can go wrong, and he just casually plays this move rook to c5. Now, this is simply a double question mark move that turns it from a draw into a loss in this position. Alireza obviously could have gone back to e4, and after rook to a6, the game probably ends in a draw, but instead he plays rook c5. Now, my reasoning behind why Alireza played this move is that I think Alireza simply was a little bit too overconfident. Everything had been going his way in this tournament, and he just sort of fell asleep at the wheel thinking nothing bad could happen. When you combine it with the fact that he's beaten me very recently in both the SEC as well as the first game here, I think he thought he was walking on water, and he just fell asleep, thought there's no way anything could go wrong. But after this move, I'm able to trade the rooks on c5 here, and he simply resigns on the spot. Now you ask, why does he resign? He can just take. The reason he resigns is after king to e5, the king is simply boxed out here. The king cannot get back to the d file. My king covers the squares, and after king c4, king f4, here takes. You'll notice that I'm winning both of the white pawns, and now this is a very simple theoretical winning endgame here. I go king g3, I go here, and now the pawn gets through, I get a queen, and I win the game. So after rook takes c5, Alireza simply resigns the game. I get a second win in this tournament, but more importantly, I stop Alireza's 5-game winning streak, and my team, the American Gambits, we go on to defeat the Treveni Kings, and we're now in, I think, 4th place by tiebreak, but we have an outside chance to maybe get to the top 2 and reach the grand final if we win all our matches. But it's still great to get a win here, to play a very solid game. Sure, it should have been a draw with perfect play, but to play a solid game, our team wins, I'm very, very happy. All right, so a big win for me in this round. Now I'm on a score with 2 wins and 1 loss, so I'm starting to have a decent result. And let's go over to the next game we're going to take a look at. Now, this game features a 5-time world champion, Magnus Carlsen, on the same score as me going to this round. 1 win, 1 loss, and a bunch of draws. So Magnus obviously wants to start winning some games and helping his team out, and he's playing against MVL. So Magnus has the white pieces, he plays d4, we get knight to f6, c4, g6, and now Magnus plays a very enterprising move, 3h4. Now this is a move that in olden times would never be considered by anyone. It's just a move that makes no sense whatsoever. But thanks to the advent of computer programs and the rise of how strong they become, they will say push p on the edge of the board no matter what, and it doesn't even matter. Now, it's also worth pointing out that Maxime has played this h4 variation with the white pieces, so he should feel right at home. We get bishop g7, knight c3, d6, and now we have the move e4 from Magnus. MVL goes knight c6, and here we get the move knight ge2, castles, and f3. Now, what has happened here is we have transposed in the classic same-ish variation of the King's Indian defense. There's a big white center, and you put the knight on e2 and the pawn on f3. Now, normally the way you reach this would be from this order, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f3, castles, knight e2, and knight c6. Now, this is actually the first variation that I learned in the King's Indian when I was 9 years old, and my stepfather was teaching me, and normally white goes bishop e3 or bishop g5. Now the reason that I bring this up is I just want to point out one fun line which I learned as a kid, which is bishop e3, rook e8, knight c1, and now after e5, d5, you have knight to d4, and after white plays, I think, knight b3, there's c5, takes, and d5 here, and I think this is supposed to be okay for black, but it's very, very complicated. So remember, I learned this variation when I think I was 9 years old, maybe 10 years old. It's been many years since I played it, obviously, but this was something my stepfather taught me. So back to the game here. We get this position after f3, Maxime goes e5, d5, knight d4, and now we get to move bishop e3. Now I do want to point out that if white were to take what looks like a free juicer here in the center of the board, black can sack the knight on e4 to attack the queen on the diagonal here. And after white takes with the queen, it's uh-oh spaghetti-o time. There's rook to e8, pinning the queen on the e file, and once white loses the queen, white will lose the game. So we get bishop e3. Maxime plays c5, building the classic diamond hands formation with the knight and the bastion here in the center, and Magnus plays end peasant with pawn takes pawn. Maxime takes back, we get takes, and now we have the move d5. Now remember, I just showed you guys a variation where black goes d5, the difference being, of course, that the pawn is on h2 and the rook is on e8. But with the pawn being on h4, black is down a pawn here, but he's trying to attack in the center very, very quickly. So Magnus takes, and now he plays move e5 here. Very important that white does not take on d5, because now after bishop b7, this king is very weak. If you go bishop e2, there's maybe queen c7, rook e8, and even though white is up 2 pawns, there are a lot of weaknesses in this position, and it's very hard to play, especially with no increment. So Magnus goes e5, trying to keep the center portion of the board closed, and we get to move knight h5. Magnus plays king to f2 here, trying to stop knight g3, which would fork the rook and the bishop, and now MVL goes rook e8. Magnus plays queen d2, and now we get to move bishop takes e5. And at this point, it's important to take stock of the position after the trade and queen d4. Material is leveled out here, both sides have the same number of pawns on the board, but white is trying to argue that this pawn on d5 is very weak, and without the classic dark square fianchettoed bishop, black won't be able to attack in the center of the board. So MVL goes queen to f6 here, and now we get to move rook d1. If Magnus were to play the move knight takes pawn, trying to win a free juicer, black creates the classic fossil with rook to e2, checking the king, and now when you take the tower, you lose your queen and you lose the game. So Magnus, of course, goes rook to d1, guarding the queen against any fossils, and now we get bishop b7, guarding the pawn on d5. Magnus plays g4, and now we get knight to f4 here. What Magnus is trying to do is he's trying to kick these pieces around, make them a little bit weak, and create a wild mess on the board. So we get rook to e1 here, and now MVL plays rook to e6. Important move, by the way. You cannot go for the fossil with rook e2 checking the king, because after knight takes rook, now the knight guards the queen on d4, and white is simply up a rook, and you resign the game immediately. So we get rook to e6 here, guarding the queen on f6, and now Magnus trades the queens and goes king g3. At this point, we're in a classic endgame here. Material is even here, but you figure it's Magnus Carlsen, the greatest player of all time. He's going to find some way to win this, right? He's just got to find a way. So we get the move rook b8 here from MVL. Magnus goes rook to h2. A logical move is it guards the pawn on b2 from being attacked, but you can also swing the rook over to d2 to pressure the pawn on d5. We get h6 here from MVL, rook d2, and now we get to move king g7. Now what MVL is trying to do here is eventually he wants to play something like g5 here to lock in the bastion on f4 where the knight is guarded, and maybe use the h file to attack the white king on g3. So we get rook to e5 here from Magnus, trying to stop g5, and now MVL goes bishop c6. Here Magnus plays b3, removing any threats towards the pawn on b2, and we get to move rook b4. Magnus goes knight to e2, and here we reach a very pivotal moment where MVL plays the move rook to e6. Now, this move is a big inaccuracy from MVL according to the computer, but it's actually, in a way, a genius idea. Now, when Maxime plays rook to e6, he's expecting the trade, and with the trade, now the knight and the rook cover this d4 square, whereas if black were to play something like, let me just set up a random position. If white were ever able to get something like this, for example, I'm just going to set it up. Something like this, if white can get the rook and the knight here, the knight blockading the pawn and these kingside pawns stopping this knight from ever jumping anywhere, this would be a big positional advantage for white in such a case. However, after rook to e6, if white trades, the knight here will always stop knight d4, and down the road you might even be pushing your d-pawn to open up the scope on the diagonal. So after rook e6, we get knight takes f4 from Magnus. He sacks the rook, but in return he has knight d3 forking these rooks on b4 and e5. MVL plays rook to d4, trying to pin the knight, and this is really the critical moment where Magnus makes a huge mistake and plays this move rook c2. Now, probably Magnus missed the move rook d4, and he concluded that after taking the rook and playing this endgame with rook takes a2, white has a bishop and a knight versus a rook and a pawn here. Computer thinks white is very slightly better. Magnus probably thought he had no winning chances, and he chooses not to do it. But when he plays rook c2, breaking the pin of the rook and attacking the bishop and now the rook, he probably forgot that Maxime can simply go rook e6, and out of nowhere Maxime is simply up a tower for a knight in an endgame, and Magnus has thrown it all away and he probably is going to lose. What on earth is Magnus doing? Now, you will notice that MVL is moving very quickly as well. He's trying to put the pressure on the clock, trying to hurt Magnus on time, and it seems as though Magnus probably just cracked under the pressure. So after rook e6, we get king f2, MVL goes a5, we get knight c5, and now we have the move rook to f6. Magnus goes king g3, and here we get the move rook to f4, creating the classic double stack and pressuring the pawn on f3. Magnus goes bishop g2, we get the move rook to b4, and at this point it's clear that MVL is going to win, because as long as this rook is not getting trapped somehow, black can just bring the rooks around and re-coordinate. In the long run, black will win because of the material advantage. So we get knight d3, Magnus plays rook b6, we get knight e5, and here MVL plays rook to e6, we get f4, and now we have the move f6, kicking the horse out of the e5 square. And now with the e file opening, the towers on the open c and e files is looking very, very dire. So we get knight to f3, MVL goes rook e3, rook d2, and now we get this move a4, trying to break the white pawn chain on the queen side. Magnus plays king f2, and now we get pawn takes pawn. Here MVL is sacking the rook, but in return for the temporary sack, he can now push p with b2, rook guards the pawn, rook guards the queen square, and white will have to give up the last rook on the board for the pawn, and Magnus is going to lose. There is no coming back from this. So we get rook d1, queen takes, and now we have to move knight to d4. MVL goes bishop b7, guarding this pawn on d5, and here Magnus plays g5. We get takes, and now we have the move rook b2, attacking both the pawn on a2 and the bishop on g2 at the same time. Now, it's very clear that at this point, Magnus is going to lose. It's just a matter of how many more moves he plays, and the game will end in a few, as we see. We get bishop h3, takes, king f4, king f7, king e5, and now Maxime plays king e7. Magnus goes bishop f1, we get rook to a3, king f4, and now we have the move bishop a6 being played. Obviously, Magnus cannot trade the bishops here, because after takes, and king e5, black will simply go king f7. If you take, I check and win the juicer on g5. And even if somehow you're able to get something like this, for example, where you go knight d4, black will just go rook g3, collect the pawn again, and win quite easily. So Magnus goes bishop g2, and now after move king to d6 here from MVL, Magnus Carlsen resigns and loses his second game in the event. A very, very tough loss for him to lose like this. A game where it seemed like he was doing okay, a little bit worse out of the opening, but then reached one of his patented endgames, but still makes a blunder low on time and ends up losing. So a huge loss for Magnus. The team would also go on to lose because of this game. So it's a really, really tight race right now in terms of who's going to get to the top two spots. But at any rate, it is always a shocker when Magnus loses, especially when he loses in an endgame like this. So some shockers: Magnus loses, Alireza loses, but it was a very exciting 7th day here at the Global Chess League in London. If you guys are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with another recap after I play Magnus Carlsen himself in the 8th round of the Global Chess League tomorrow. So hope you guys are ready for that. I'm going to call it for right now, but hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all very, very soon. Have a good one. Bye.